They grew up. They have their own lives, their own choices, their own silences. But inside you, that image still lives. The boy with scraped knees, the girl who used to hug you before bed. And it's precisely because of that unconditional love that, without realizing it, many parents make the most devastating mistake after the age of 60. They say words that sound like affection but actually plant guilt, distance, and a pain that will never be confessed. You may have said it just yesterday and didn't even notice. But Freud had already warned. Behind the innocent word often lies the unconscious desire to control, to remain indispensable, to not be left behind. Have you ever stopped to think that a simple phrase, said in the impulse of longing or the exhaustion of frustration, can mark your children for the rest of their lives? After everything I did for you. It sounds like a release, but it becomes a burden. Freud would call this an inverted projection. When what we crave as affection disguises itself as a demand. And the worst part is, for the child, this weight cannot be returned. They just drift away, silently. Not because they don't love you, but because they no longer know how to come close without feeling guilty. Maybe all you wanted was a simple thank you, or for them to call more often, or to hear that they miss you. But the raw, painful truth is, the more you try to demand love, the less it blooms. According to Freud, genuine love is born from freedom, not obligation. True affection cannot be forced. And that's why, after 60, the greatest gift you can give your children is not your constant presence but your emotional maturity, the ability to be whole without depending on their response. You deserve care, attention, companionship, but not at the cost of their peace or yours. Age brings wisdom, but also vulnerability. And it's during this stage that many parents stumble into an old unconscious desire to remain essential in their children's lives, even if by force. Freud saw this as a dangerous cycle. Parents who feel forgotten begin to victimize themselves, and children, instead of drawing closer, feel pressured and pull away. Do you see the risk? A single wrong phrase can be the beginning of a silent and permanent drift. So, if you love your children, and I know you do, choose your words wisely. Because sometimes in trying to get closer, you may be building an invisible wall. Never say, "You don't care about me anymore." Never say, "You'll only remember me when I'm gone." These phrases don't build bridges. They create chasms. And love, when wounded by words, doesn't scream. It just goes quiet. And that silence, my friend, is far harder to heal than any absence. There are phrases that should never be spoken, not because they are offensive, but because they carry an invisible poison that slowly destroys the bond between parents and children. And after the age of 60, that risk becomes even greater. It's when loneliness starts to make more noise than affection. When a father or mother, now aged, looks at the phone wishing for a call that never comes. It is in this silence that the unconscious impulse to manipulate love through words is born. Sigmund Freud teaches us that often the unconscious of parents projects onto their children their own unresolved anguish, turning simple gestures into mechanisms of guilt. Imagine the following scene. A father with trembling hands and a choked voice says to his son over the phone, "You'll only visit me when I'm in a coffin." It sounds like a cry of pain, but Freud would see it as a cry from a wounded ego, trying to become indispensable through suffering. What was meant to be a plea for love turns into a fortress of guilt. The son, unable to respond to this pain without hurting himself, begins to pull away. Not out of lack of love, but out of self-preservation. And so the Freudian dynamic of repetition is formed. Parents unconsciously repeat the emotional patterns that hurt them the most. Throughout life, we build images in our children of who we are, heroes, caregivers, pillars of the family. But time, both cruel and necessary, dismantles those roles, and many parents can't accept that symbolic rupture. Freud stated that the difficulty in dealing with one's own aging often leads individuals to reenact old dramas, trying to maintain their central role through pain. This is the point where phrases like, "No one cares about me anymore," or "I've been forgotten," stop being mere complaints and become unconscious mechanisms of emotional blackmail. But here lies the key. When you say those things, you're not really speaking to your adult child. You're speaking to the boy or girl they once were, the one who needed your love to survive, who did everything to please you, who felt guilty for every tear they saw in your eyes. The adult they've become can rationalize, but the child that still lives within them reacts with fear, with retreat. Freud called this the return of the repressed, when an unresolved trauma rises back to the surface, reopening old wounds. And every time you say what should never have been said, it is the past that speaks, not the present. That's why the first step is conscious silence. Not the silence of pride, but the silence of reflection. Before uttering any impulsive phrase, ask yourself, is this coming from my pain or from my love? Because after 60, the way you communicate with your children carries an even deeper impact. Your words leave marks, not just because you are aging, but because they now listen through a different filter. The filter of adulthood, responsibility, and guilt. And if what you truly want is connection, you must choose the language of emotional maturity, not resentment disguised as affection. When Freud spoke about the ego and its defense mechanisms, he warned us of something few have the courage to admit. Sometimes the ego prefers to play the victim rather than accept that it is no longer the center of someone else's world. After the age of 60, this mechanism intensifies. Many parents begin to confuse love with the number of phone calls, the quality of the relationship with the frequency of visits, as if absence were a confirmation of lovelessness. But adult life is filled with noise, rush, and pressure, and it's not fair to measure affection by how much time is available. When you say, "You don't love me anymore," what your child hears is, "You were never enough," and guilt paralyzes them. This is where a dangerous trap comes in, the role of the martyr. The parent who, feeling left aside, starts to collect sacrifices like trophies of affection. "I gave up my life for you. I never thought about myself. You were all I had." Freud would see in this one of the clearest expressions of the unconscious desire to retain emotional power. And there is no tyranny more subtle than that which is exercised in the name of love. When care becomes a form of charge, it ceases to be a gift and becomes a debt. And no relationship survives an emotional contract where only one side is demanding. For true reconnection to happen, this pattern must be broken. It's essential to understand that children, even as adults, are still learning how to manage their own pain. And if you want to be a safe harbor, you must be emotionally steady, not a stormy sea of unmet needs. Freud would say that a parent's emotional maturity is revealed not when their needs are met, but when they can love without expecting anything in return. That is when love becomes pure. It is when you love without demanding that the other feels free to love you back, not out of obligation, but out of choice. Saying "I miss you" is very different from saying "you never reach out anymore." The first opens space for connection. The second builds walls of guilt. Your children's unconscious responds to the way you speak, even if they aren't aware of it. A single phrase can rekindle childhood memories, reopen old wounds, or stir feelings of helplessness. And when that happens, what should have been a moment of reunion turns into avoidance. Freud believed that words carry psychic energy. They don't just convey information, they transform. That's why being mindful of your words is actually an act of caring for the relationship. If you want your children to come closer, start by being a safe space, not a field of judgment. Welcome them with kindness, listen with lightness, and choose words that don't pressure but invite. Children don't want to run away from their parents. They run from pain they don't know how to heal. And often, that pain wasn't caused by direct aggression, but by small emotional shocks born from poorly chosen words. After 60, your words carry more weight than you might imagine. Use that influence to heal, not to hurt. There is a brutal difference between saying "I need you" and saying "you owe me this." And it is precisely on that fine line that many parents in old age end up slipping. Freud reminds us that neurosis often arises from the confusion between desire and obligation, between what one legitimately feels and what is demanded from the other as compensation. When children sense that their parents' love is conditioned on some form of repayment, even if unspoken, they begin to carry a silent tension. And over time, that tension turns into distance. How many times have you told yourself you didn't need anything, but deep down expected everything? That you didn't care whether they called or not, but felt a knot in your chest when a week passed in silence? Freud would call this a denial mechanism. The unconscious deeply desires something, but the conscious mind refuses to admit it. And this contradiction generates frustration, irritation, bitterness. At this point, parents may start to become harsh, sarcastic, cold, not because they stopped loving, but because they felt ignored in their deepest needs. And love, when wounded, can become resentment disguised as indifference. The challenge is to look inward with honesty, to recognize that the desire for closeness is legitimate, but that it cannot become a demand. Freud said that emotional maturity requires the renunciation of primary narcissism. That is, letting go of the idea that the world and our children exist to satisfy us. To love someone is to allow them to grow, to drift away, to rediscover themselves, even when it hurts. Because true connection is not built on constant presence, but on the freedom to return. Children always come back to where they feel good. And you can be that place. This doesn't mean giving up on your own feelings. It means learning to express them clearly, without dramatization. Saying "I miss you" with tenderness is far more powerful than dramatizing with hurtful words. Freud believed that repressed affection always finds a way to express itself, and when it escapes through the wrong door, it becomes resentment. That's why learning to speak with emotional maturity is a gesture of mental health, not weakness. It's knowing how to care for your love with responsibility instead of turning it into a tool of pressure. You can be the bridge that connects, or the chasm that divides. The choice lies in every word that leaves your mouth. After 60, communication between parents and children needs more sweetness, more listening, more symbolism, because life passes quickly and the words that build today may become, tomorrow, the memories that comfort or that wound. If you want to be remembered with affection, begin now to choose words that embrace, not accuse. Freud would say, "The way you speak about love says more about what you feel than any gesture ever could." As we age, we experience a loss of the social roles that once gave us identity and relevance. Freud stated that this transition can trigger deep crises in the ego, which desperately seeks new ways to reaffirm itself. The problem arises when this need for recognition turns toward one's children, transforming them into instruments for maintaining a self-esteem that no longer finds support elsewhere. That's when parents begin to say things like, "Without you, my life has no meaning," a burden far too heavy to be carried by someone still trying to understand their own path. The root of the problem is not the phrase itself, but what lies behind it. The expectation that children will fill a void that is, in truth, existential. Freud taught that human beings must learn to face loss and finitude, and that emotional maturity means finding internal meaning, not external validation. When a parent places upon their child the task of saving them from the loneliness of old age, love becomes a prison. And no affection can survive without space to breathe. That's why many children distance themselves. Not out of cruelty, but for psychological survival. The emotional overload suffocates them. They feel that nothing they do will ever be enough to fill that emotional chasm opened in their parent's soul. Freud would call this a late symbiotic relationship, when parents and children, instead of walking side by side, become fused in an unhealthy way, damaging the autonomy of both. For the relationship to be healthy, clear boundaries must exist. What belongs to the child, what belongs to the parent, what is part of the past, and what is still possible in the present. If you feel this emptiness, look at it with compassion, not despair. Don't try to fill it with your children's constant presence. Fill it with new meaning, new activities, new discoveries about yourself. Freud believed that human beings are capable of transforming any pain, as long as they are willing to face it with courage. And there is nothing braver than a parent who, in aging, chooses to grow inwardly instead of shrinking into their own emotional needs. In the end, children don't need perfect parents. They need authentic ones. Parents who can ask for help without playing the victim, who can express longing without manipulation. The love between parents and children is a symbolic field, and the words we plant there either blossom or rot, depending on the quality of the affection that accompanies them. After 60, you don't lose value, you gain depth. And that depth can become the greatest gift to those you love, if you learn to express it with wisdom. Old age, for Freud, is also the stage in life when the unconscious reveals itself with greater intensity. With fewer external distractions, unresolved conflicts from the past resurface. That's why older parents often begin to relive old grievances, long-forgotten guilt, or resentments stored away for decades. And without realizing it, they begin to unload these pains onto their children. Not out of revenge, but as an unconscious attempt to process what was never resolved. When you say something like, "You've always been the distant one," you're speaking more about your own pain than about your child's current behavior. This emotional transference is a natural process, but it needs to be recognized. Otherwise, it turns into emotional sabotage. Freud stated that what is not processed returns as a symptom. And in the parent-child relationship, that symptom may take the form of distance, coldness, or constant conflict. The solution lies in awareness. When a parent realizes they are using their children as a mirror for their unresolved frustrations, they have the opportunity to break the cycle and begin a new type of bond, lighter, more honest, more liberating. Acknowledging this requires courage. It's not easy to admit that part of our pain comes from within, not from others' absence, but that honesty is the foundation of emotional maturity. By doing so, you not only free yourself, you free your children from the burden of fixing something that was never theirs to fix. And that freedom is the first step toward reconnection. Because true love doesn't demand repair. It simply asks for conscious presence. Freud believed that healing is allowing the past to find its place, without letting it leak into the present. If you want a new kind of relationship with your children, start by looking inward. Which pains are still speaking through you? Which words leave your mouth but come from old wounds? The most important work in old age is not controlling your children. It's taking care of yourself more deeply than ever before. And by doing that, you become not just a figure of authority, but a true example of transformation and wisdom. Freud said that the human being is always under construction, even at 70, 80, 90 years old. In the eyes of your children, a father who evolves is more inspiring than a father who demands. A mother who rediscovers herself is more admirable than a mother who plays the victim. If you want to be remembered with tenderness, start now to build that image with conscious gestures, careful words, and reflective silence. After 60, every word has the power to heal or to wound, and you more than ever have the wisdom to choose the path of healing. There is a silent, almost imperceptible moment when children begin to hide parts of their lives so as not to hurt their parents, and it's not because they've lost love or the bond, it's because they no longer feel emotionally safe to share. When parents start responding to everything with judgment, pressure, or subtle emotional blackmail, the child stops seeing home as a refuge and starts seeing it as a minefield. Freud warned us of this ego defense behavior. When the emotional environment is unstable, the unconscious protects itself through withdrawal. What a parent sees as coldness is, in fact, just self-defense. In such cases, guilt acts like a silent virus. The child who avoids contact carries an inner conflict that consumes them. They feel they should be more present, but every attempt to get closer results in discomfort. The Freudian mind explains this as emotional ambivalence. To love and reject at the same time, to want closeness but fear the pain it brings. It's a psychological prison. And the key to escape lies in the hands of the parent who chooses to mature emotionally, create space for listening, and transform each encounter into a place of warmth, not tension. The true power of a father or mother lies not in control, but in understanding. After 60, that understanding must become the primary virtue. Freud invites us to see the other not as an extension of our ego, but as an autonomous being with their own desires. When a child is respected in their freedom, they return naturally, and that return isn't just physical, it's symbolic. They feel comfortable sharing, laughing, making mistakes, and simply existing around their parents without fear of judgment or emotional manipulation. And perhaps asking for forgiveness is necessary, not for major mistakes, but for the small wounds that have accumulated in silences and in words spoken with harshness. Freud said healing happens when we finally speak about what was never spoken. Sometimes a simple, "I'm sorry if I pressured you," is worth more than 1,000 explanations. That small, rare gesture is capable of dissolving decades of tension. Because forgiveness, in Freud's view, is not just about freeing the other. It's about freeing yourself from the invisible chains that keep you tied to the past. There is no shame in admitting you were wrong. The shame lies in repeating the mistake for fear of seeming weak. The greatness of a parent, after 60, is not in always being right. It's in being able to evolve emotionally. If you have the courage to look inward with honesty, to talk to your children with humility, you don't just rebuild the relationship. You create a new cycle, where love is no longer an obligation, but a choice once again. Freud described aging as a stage in which the superego, the moral and judgmental part of the mind, becomes more rigid, more demanding. It's as if, by losing control over the body and over time, the individual tries to compensate by imposing emotional rules on others. You should do this for me. You need to be here. I deserve more. But this excess of moral demand, when not accompanied by empathy, turns the relationship into an arena of frustrated expectations. The children, pressured by this invisible tribunal, begin to avoid contact so as not to be silently condemned. This psychic rigidity, according to Freud, is not a sign of authority, but of unconscious insecurity. When an elderly person feels they are losing relevance, they try to reassert it by imposing values, traditions, or emotional obligations on their children. But what they fail to realize is that, by doing this, they destroy precisely the bond they wish to preserve. Instead of becoming a cherished presence, they become an emotional burden. And the children, even though they love them, begin to create strategies of distance. Not from lack of affection, but from emotional exhaustion. But there is an antidote to this rigidity: symbolic listening. Freud believed that the unconscious reveals itself in the details, in a look, in an absence, in a sentence left unfinished. Listening deeply means going beyond words. It means welcoming without interruption, understanding that the adult child still carries within them the reflection of what they experienced with you. And that's why every true act of listening is also a form of healing, for them and for you. It's a silent reconfiguration of affection, where defenses drop and love can re-emerge. Allow yourself to relearn how to love. Allow yourself to become a new kind of father, a new kind of mother. After 60, love should no longer be a struggle for space. It should be a celebration of lasting presence. You are still important, yes, but in a different way. As a lighthouse, not as a chain. As an emotional reference, not as a collector of emotional debts. When a child feels free, they return. And they return because they want to, not because they're afraid of hurting you. This is perhaps the greatest lesson Freud offers us in this stage of life. To love is to accept change. To accept that children change, that roles change, that you yourself change, and that it's okay. The bond doesn't have to be the same as it was in childhood to still be strong. Love evolves. And it's up to you to decide whether that evolution will be bitter and resentful, or calm and conscious. Many parents, in their sincerity, believe they are simply expressing what they feel. But the unconscious, as Freud said, is never innocent. It hides intentions behind gestures, manipulation behind affection, demands disguised as care. The phrase, "Do whatever you want, I don't matter anymore anyway," is not neutral. It's a double-edged sword. It sounds like resignation but cuts like an accusation. And the child, upon hearing it, feels trapped in an emotional snare from which they cannot escape without guilt. The effect is devastating. A presence that should be a source of affection becomes a stage of tension. The child starts avoiding calls, visits, contact, not because they don't love, but because every interaction turns into a dance of guilt and justification. And this is a cycle that can only be broken when the parent takes responsibility for their own pain and decides not to unload it onto others. Freud teaches us that maturity is, above all, the abandonment of idealizations. No one is going to love you exactly the way you expect. But that doesn't mean they don't love you. It's necessary to accept that the love of adult children is not the same as the love of childhood. It's not constant, not explicit, not devoted. But it is real. It's in the message that arrives at the end of the day. In the casual, "How are you?" In the small gestures. Freud called this affective displacement, the way the unconscious expresses emotions through less obvious paths. Grown-up love doesn't shout. It whispers. And you only recognize it when you quiet your own expectations. What do you expect from them today? Attention? Validation? Gratitude? All of these are legitimate, but if demanded as conditions for affection, they lose their meaning. The true gift of old age is the chance to become a source of peace for those you love. And that doesn't require you to be perfect, only conscious, that you turn your pain into wisdom, your silences into understanding, your words into shelter. And if you manage to do that, your children will draw near, not out of obligation, but out of desire. Because no one resists affection free of demand. And in the end, as Freud would say, all healing begins when we stop demanding and start offering. Offering presence, listening, welcome. And above all, offering the freedom for the other to be who they are, even if that means being different from what you once dreamed. The relationship between parents and children is the first stage on which the human drama unfolds. Freud saw in this bond the origin of many of the conflicts that shape our personality. And for that very reason, when time passes and roles are reversed, when children begin to care for their parents, a new challenge arises, not turning that care into a battlefield. Many parents feel diminished by dependence and project that frustration onto their children. "I don't need your help. I'm not a burden." Yet at the same time, they feel hurt when their children don't anticipate their needs. This ambivalence is understandable, but dangerous. If left unacknowledged, it turns into resentment. And resentment, Freud said, is one of the most silent poisons of the soul. It builds up in small gestures, in offhand remarks, in unspoken expectations. And suddenly, what should have been a moment of reconnection becomes a living space filled with tension. Children walk on eggshells, and parents feel invisible or ignored. But all of this can be reversed if there's willingness to rewrite the script. And rewriting the script requires humility. It demands looking inward and realizing, I am not the same father or mother I once was, and that's okay. I can learn a new way to love, a new way to relate. Freud called this the reconstruction of the self, The ability to reorganize our identity even in the face of loss. Old age is not the end of the psychological path, but a new chapter, and this chapter can be written with more empathy, more listening, and more awareness than any other. When children sense that you're trying to change, they change too. The relationship becomes lighter, more human. The old dynamic of demand gives way to spontaneous care. And that only happens when you decide to abandon the role of the victim and take on the role of author of your own story. Freud said, "There is no liberation without responsibility." And that applies to everyone, including parents. If you've made it this far, it's because you seek transformation. And that alone is something great. It doesn't matter what was said before. What matters is what will be said from this point on. And if you choose the language of maturity, of welcome, of freedom, your children will hear it. Maybe not the same day, maybe not in the way you expect, but they will hear. And one day they'll return with their hearts more open than ever. We've reached the crucial point. What do you want to leave as your legacy? I'm not talking about possessions, nor about old stories told again and again at the dinner table. I'm talking about emotional memory, the way your children will remember you when you're no longer around. Freud taught us that the unconscious holds deep, almost indelible impressions from childhood, adolescence, and adult life, and that parents are the most powerful figures in that inner world. What you say today, after 60, may become the inner voice your children will hear for the rest of their lives. Do you want to be remembered as someone who judged, or someone who understood? As someone who wounded with subtle words, or someone who healed with generous silences? Freud said the affection that remains is the one that doesn't wound. And true love is the kind that reinvents itself. Even in old age, it is possible to rewrite the marks we leave on others. A new phrase, a new gesture, a new look can slowly erase the pain that time alone couldn't resolve. Don't expect perfection, not from yourself, not from others. Just choose every day to be a source of peace. Use your experience not to judge, but to welcome. Use your pain not to accuse, but to teach. And use your voice, now more filled with wisdom than ever, to say the words your children most need to hear. I love you exactly as you are, and I'm proud of who you've become. That phrase, spoken sincerely, has transformative power. Freud would call this psychic reorganization. When affection is freed from the weight of guilt and begins to flow again with lightness, from there everything changes. The relationship strengthens. Hurt gives way to affection. And time, once thought lost, becomes an ally once more. You can do this. And you can begin now. Because at the end of life, what matters most isn't how many visits or phone calls you received. It's the silence between two eyes that know, despite everything, that love still exists. A love that is mature, conscious, free, and therefore eternal. And perhaps now, at the end of it all, you realize that the true power of words doesn't lie in how loudly they're spoken, but in the silence they leave behind when they truly touch someone. Throughout this journey, we've walked through the labyrinths of the human mind, revisited wounds that time tried to hide, and dove into the invisible gestures that shape the love between parents and children. Freud showed us that the soul doesn't grow old. It simply changes form, represses desires, transforms affection into defense, and sometimes, in its attempt to preserve love, ends up pushing it away. But here, in front of every sentence, a choice is born: to wound or to heal, to repeat or to reframe, to imprison or to set free. It's not too late to rewrite the story. Age has never been an obstacle to transformation, only an invitation for it to be done with more awareness. After 60, life takes on a new hue, more sober, more profound, more truthful, and it is in this mature soil that the purest forms of affection can bloom. Words spoken with tenderness, glances that don't demand, silences that embrace. The love that survives time is the love that has learned to let the other be who they are. And that takes courage. The same courage you're showing now, simply by listening this far. You are not what others said you had to be. You are what you choose to become from this moment on. Freud believed that the unconscious does act upon us, but that consciousness is the only path to free ourselves from the cycle of repetition. Every phrase you choose not to say from now on is a door that opens. Every act of listening is a step closer to reconnection. And every time you love without expectation, you plant the kind of memory that never dies, because it lives on in the heart of the one who received that love freely. So tell your children what was never told to you: that you love them without demands, that you miss them without blame, that yes, you've grown old, but that this has only made you more whole, that you no longer need applause, only presence, Because in the end, all children really want is an emotional home they can return to without fear. And all that a father or mother truly desires is to be that home. Not out of obligation, but out of essence. Like a lighthouse that shines even when no one is watching. Like a voice that echoes even after silence has settled in. If this message resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who also needs to heal the words they've been saying without realizing. Leave a comment below. What touched you the most in this video? What phrase will you avoid from now on? And if you wish to continue this journey with us, of depth, awareness, and transformation, subscribe to the channel, not out of habit, but out of connection, out of choice. Because together we can ensure that every word spoken from now on becomes a bridge, never again a wound.